In this video, I'm going to show you how to do a basic edit with Lightroom Classic. Now the first thing I normally do is go to Profile, because when you first load up an image into Lightroom, it changes it to Adobe Color. I like to start from Adobe Standard. Then what I do is select our white pinpointer and select somewhere white on my image. This is going to give us a great starting point for our temperature. It's going to the sliders here, if I just go back quickly, you can see them sliders moving, the temperature and tint sliders moving. Again, if you look at the original image, it's just slightly green, which is not desirable. Next, we move down to exposure and contrast. Now I know the exposure of this image is correct, but you can move this up and down if you feel your image is too dark or too light. Now most people change the contrast as well, but I'm going to go down to our highlights, shadows, whites and blacks to alter the contrast rather than the contrast slider itself. A common technique with the highlights and shadows is to lower the highlights all the way to the bottom and raise the shadows all the way to the top. This gives it like a HDR-y look, and it isn't down to I don't like that personally. It's a bit over the top and a little bit artificial for my liking, but people do like that, and remember, there is no wrong or right way of doing it. But what I like doing is lowering the highlights slightly, bringing out a little bit more detail and information in the textures, and raising the shadows just so we get a bit more information from the dark areas. Next we go down to the white slider, and if we press Alt on our keyboard and raise our whites, what this is going to do is going to show us the bright areas or the highlights in our image. And what you want to make sure of here is that you don't blow out the highlights, or you're going to lose information. Again, there's no right way or wrong way of doing this, but just make sure if you don't want to blow out the whites and lose information, you don't raise it too fast. As soon as you see a little bit of white coming through your image, that's a good indication that you're at the right spot. We do the same with the blacks, and again, if we hold down Alt and lower the blacks, we get a good indication of when we're starting to crush them dark areas. Now I like to add a little bit more dark into my image. That's just my own personal style, and that's how I do it. Then we move on to texture and clarity. There's a little bit of confusion over these sliders. Now the texture brings out the finer details, and the clarity improves the whole clarity of the whole image. So I like to raise the texture a little bit so we get that detail in the textures. I also like to raise my clarity so the whole image comes a little bit more clearer and we get that detail coming through. Now the dehaze slider, if we lower it one way, it kind of adds a mist or haze to the image, and if we raise it, it removes the haze from our image. I always like to add a little bit of dehaze, raising it up just slightly, just to make, again, it a little bit more clear, the image. Now we go on to the vibrance and saturation, and again, this is down to personal preference, but I like to raise the vibrance by about +20 or +30 on every image, and lower the saturation down to -10. Now that comes down to personal taste. Have a mess around with this to what you think it should be. Some people like a lot more saturation, some people like it a lot lower. Here you can see before and after. Already the color balance is a lot better. We've upped the contrast slightly, and we've brought out that information in the shadows, so we're getting a lot more detail in the shadows there. The biggest point from this is just the basic tab, and what we're getting from this is a really good starting point before we add some more detail and adjusting the colors individually. Let's move on. Okay, now we go on to the tone curve, and this is again down to personal preference. What I like to do with these is slide them up and down and look at the image to see which way it improves the image. Now I raise it here in this case, and I can see that that's bringing out a little bit more of the highlights, which improves the image. Again, with the lights, it's all down to personal taste, and again, raising it makes it look a little bit better in my opinion. We're just lowering them darks just to add a little bit more contrast to it all, and there we go. So it's really down to personal preference on the tone curve. Next, I like to go down to detail and add a little bit of sharpening onto my images. Now the best way of doing this is to enlarge your image and press Alt and just raise your slider until the key to this is not overdoing it again too much and you've over sharpened it and it's going to look a little bit over sharpened. But Normally around 70 or 80 I find is the key. Next is radius by holding down Alt again. And what this does is it shows you what is bringing out the detail, and you want it to a point where you're just beginning to see it sharpen. Next we go down to detail, and by holding Alt again, all we're going to do is raise the slider until we can see the detail coming through, and by holding Alt we can actually see it a lot more easy. Now masking, hold down Alt again. This is going to show you what parts are getting sharpened and what parts are not. Raise it until you only get the parts you need sharpened. You don't want the whole image to be sharpened, you just want the straight edges. Now with noise reduction, the best place to go is in the sky. Zoom in even more, you can see it's a bit noisy. So I'm just going to raise it. If you hold down Alt again, it goes black and white so you can see the noise. And again, around about 50 there, that's reduced that noise down quite nicely. We're just looking to enhance the photo all the time. Now one of the things I also like to do is always make sure the lens correction's on. You can double check that it's correct, and we remove any chromatic aberrations. So now we're going to be looking at the colours, and on this particular image we can see we've got these like pink, orangey red life buoys or buoys on the side of the boat here. We've also got a bit of aqua blue in the sea, and we've also got some nice colours on the building there. So we're going to be looking at bringing them out as best we can. So let's go to the HSL tab and see what our colours can do. Now again, this all comes down to personal preference, but I start with the saturation and I move the sliders to see what part of the image is being affected by the slider. Here you can see the buoys on the side of the boat are getting affected because they're red obviously. Let's have a look what the orange does. We're losing quite a lot there from the houses at the back. Brickwork and that. Let's have a look at the yellows. Just a little bit of detail there on the crate on one of the boats. Greens don't seem to do. Aqua's changing the sea there, so I want that really to pop in maybe a little bit. The aqua is just changing the colour of the sea there, which isn't a bad thing. Now the blues, some people will up the blues because of the boats, but I'm going to just lower it down, personal preference. I'm going to try and make them buoys pop a little bit more in a moment. Purples, not really a lot changing there. I'm just going to leave them about there, and the magentas. Next we move over to luminosity, and this decides how deep or light our tones are of the colours. So we'll start off with the reds, and because I want them buoys to be popping, I'm going to bring out the red a little bit more, make it a bit darker, and the oranges. Yellows, I might bring them down slightly also, maybe to about there. Looking at that buoy there, you can see what's happening. Remember also it's altering the housework in the background, the brickwork. Oh, and here's the blue. So this is all personal preference. Remember, there's no right or wrong. Just raise the blue slightly. And now the greens or the aquas in the water. So I'm going to probably stick to about there, maybe. Looks pretty good there. So there we go. Magentas, they don't adjust anything at the minute, so I'm just going to leave them at normal. Now the hue, this is going to alter obviously the colour of each of the colours. You can see there by the buoys, by changing the hue, we're getting either going from orange to deep reds. So I just want them reds to pop a bit more, and that's what I'm trying to aim for in this image. Just by moving the reds and the oranges about, I can make them reds really pop out, but leaving the rest of the image pretty still. Now the blues, I don't really want to change too much, maybe just a little bit darker blue. And now the sea, be nice if that was a little bit more green, just like that. See it, there we go. And there we've got a bit more contrast between the boats now and the sea water. And here's a before and after again. Just see how the image is progressing. Now, again, this is all down to personal taste. You can overdo this, underdo it, do whatever you feel is right. There's no right or wrong way to do this. As you can see with what I've done, I've just tried to exaggerate some of the colours slightly more than probably what the camera's brought out, because that's how I remember them. That's how I like to do my photos. I like to remember how it looked when I'd done it. I can remember them boys on the side of the boat really standing out, and that's what I'm trying to go for. Next we go to the shadows, midtones and highlights in the colour grading. Basically this is an area of Lightroom which is really handy. It's going to, obviously if you move the colour wheel around in the shadows, we're going to add that tint of colour to the shadows or the darker areas. Our midtones, if we move that around, we're going to get that tint on the midtones and the highlights, etc. So let's have a look to see how I do this. Again, it's all just down to personal preference. I find the key to it is not overdoing it though. So let's look at the shadows. I'm just moving it around till I feel or gauge what's right. And I'm going to settle maybe on a little bit of a magenta colour here, something slightly different to what many people would go for. Next we go on to the midtones. Again, we're just going to see where the colours are altering in our image. You can see the sky slightly being altered, so I don't want it too much. I remember it being a warm day, so I may settle on maybe a yellowish tint. And again, we go to the highlights now, and again we just walk around and see where the colours are changing. Kind of like that straight away. It's just had a little bit of orange there to the highlights. Now we move to the sliders and decide how much impact we want them to have on each of the image. Again, it's all down to personal taste and preference here. There's no right or wrong way of doing this. You can see just by moving the sliders, we're altering it very subtly, but bringing out the best of the image, or what we think is best for the image. Now the blending is how hard we get between the shadows and midtones and highlights. Maybe you want it to fade in gently. Now this is really called a balance. I love this slider, so you can really pull around where the shadow, midtones and highlights balance each other out. There we go. So there's a before and after, straight out the camera on the left and then after on the right. Hopefully you can see that by just very subtly adjusting all these sliders and taking your time, you can really make the image begin to pop. Remember that we start off with white balance and getting the basic tab just right, and then we're adding layers of color temperature and stuff like that, and highlights and shadows and midtones, just adjusting them very slightly to make the image pop more and bringing out the detail and how you remember it. If you look at our boys on the side of the boat compared to the original, that's what I really want to stand out. In my mind, that's what stood out to me, and the blues on the boat and the blues on the background building. I think I've done that quite well. So let's have a look at them full size. Let me know in the comments what you think and how you like to adjust your images in Lightroom. Any questions, comment below. But thanks for watching this video. We'll catch up in the next one. Thanks for watching, guys.